Spiritual awakening isn't what you think, it's far more terrifying. That phrase already unsettles something in you, doesn't it? It touches a hidden nerve, because part of you suspects awakening isn't. All light, bliss, and gentle wisdom, the phrase spiritual awakening has been polished by books and seminars into something neat and comforting. You meditate, you breathe deeply, you learn to be calm, and then everything is better. But what if that is only the front door, a carefully painted mask? What if awakening, in its raw and authentic form, is less like drifting peacefully into sunlight and more like being thrown into a storm where the ground vanishes, where you cannot return to who you once were? To call it terrifying is not an exaggeration, terrifying because it dismantles the familiar stories you have lived inside since childhood, the belief that you're a stable self, a permanent identity, a name that neatly explains what you are. Spiritual awakening begins by tearing down that facade. You start to see that the person you thought you were is not fixed, not solid, but a shifting echo of memory, desire, and social imprinting. That realization is not soft. It is like standing in front of a mirror and watching your reflection fade, until you are forced to question who is actually watching. People imagine awakening as adding something new, wisdom, clarity, maybe even supernatural powers, but in truth it is more about subtraction. You lose illusions, beliefs, attachments, and losing is rarely easy. Losing feels like death. That is why nearly every culture, from ancient Egyptian mysteries to Tibetan teachings, describes awakening in terms of dying before you die. Because only by walking through death, the death of identity, of certainty, of the small ego self, does the deeper reality become visible. Here is the part most teachers hesitate to emphasize. The experience can be deeply destabilizing. When the scaffolding of your familiar world collapses, you might feel like nothing holds you anymore. The routines that once gave you security feel hollow. Relationships shift because that people once knew no longer fits neatly into their expectations. The pursuit of success, the endless consumption, the games of social approval, suddenly they appear like shadows. You see through them. And when you see through them, you cannot pretend they are real. That is liberating, yes, but also terrifying. Because pretending was comfortable, think of it like waking up inside a dream. At first, you realize the dream is not solid, but that realization strips away the ground beneath your feet. You look round and notice the objects, the people, the stories you once believed in are made of mist. You cannot go back to believing, and yet you do not fully know what lies beyond the mist either. It is a state of in-between, and in that threshold you can feel both awe and terror at once. The terror comes from uncertainty, from the way awakening cuts through the narratives that have been your anchor. For example, you may realize time is not what you thought. You may sense that the past and future exist as mental constructs, and only the present is real. That sounds poetic until you try to live inside that truth. Without the story of my past and my future, who are you? Without the endless replay of regrets and hopes, what remains of your identity? This is not a comfortable question, but it is the doorway. Another reason awakening terrifies is because it makes you responsible. When illusions fall away, no one else can save you. No external authority, no sacred text, no tradition can substitute for your direct perception of reality. You stand alone in that awareness. Many people try to avoid it by clinging harder to systems, gurus, or beliefs. But authentic awakening leaves no room for escape. You see that the divine, the infinite, the absolute, whatever name you give, is not somewhere outside you. It is here, within and round, inseparable from what you are, and that means the responsibility rests entirely on you. Some describe the first stages of awakening as being burned alive, old patterns, attachments, and false selves dissolve in the fire of awareness. The ego resists, struggles, and tries to rebuild itself. It whispers that you are losing your mind. And maybe you are at least the mind you once knew, the one chained by unquestioned habits of thought. That burning can feel cruel, but it is also purifying. It is useful to remember that ancient wisdom traditions often place great trials at the threshold of awakening, not because the teachers wanted to be cruel, but because they knew the psyche must be strong enough to withstand the collapse of illusion. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes terrifying visions one must face. Gnostic texts speak of ashrams that must be confronted. Even modern accounts of dark nights of the soul echo the same pattern. Terror is not a mistake, it is an initiation. So, why speak of this now? To you, because too much of the modern conversation about spirituality softens the edges. It sells awakening as a lifestyle upgrade, a way to feel calm while navigating the same consumerist world. But you deserve honesty. Spiritual awakening is not a product. It is not another thing you add to your shelf of achievements. It is a rupture. It will demand you let go of things you never imagined letting go of. It will challenge you to step into vastness with no guarantee of safety. And yet, here is the paradox. While it is terrifying, it is also the most natural state. It is not something added to you, it is what you are. Once the illusions peel away, the terror comes from resistance, from clinging to shadows that are dissolving anyway. If you can endure that process, if you can sit in the unknowing, what remains is clarity. Not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of direct seeing. You realize the self is not bound by the little name and story. You realize awareness itself is limitless. This introduction sets the stage. Spiritual awakening is not what you think. It is far more terrifying, because it unmasks the truth of your existence, stripping away the layers you thought were you. It destabilizes, it burns, it demands surrender, and yet, beyond the terror, it is the doorway to reality as it is vast, alive. unsettling. When we say spiritual awakening isn't what you think, it's far more terrifying. We are pointing to a shift that cuts deeper than pleasant meditation or uplifting affirmations. Awakening is not decoration for the life you already have, it is disassembly. And to understand why it shakes people so completely, we need to look closer at its core themes and underlying concepts. These are not ideas to adopt like new beliefs. They are like mirrors, reflecting what is already here, but often unseen. One of the first themes is illusion versus reality. Nearly every culture and tradition has spoken about this divide. The Indian sages called it Maya, the veil that tricks you into thinking appearances are solid and final. Plato described it as shadows on the cave wall, mistaken for a truth. In modern times, psychology calls it conditioning, while physicists suggest matter is not solid but vibrations of energy. However you name it, the message is similar. What you take as the world is not the full story. Spiritual awakening is the piercing of this veil. That piercing is not gentle. It reveals that many of the things you relied on, your status, your possessions, even your own self-image, are fragile constructs. The moment you glimpse this, comfort begins to slip away. Another theme is death and rebirth. Awakening repeatedly forces you into cycles where old identities dissolve and something new emerges. It can feel like dying, not physically but psychologically. You watch as beliefs, desires, and attachments fall apart. Sometimes it happens slowly, other times suddenly. Like a floor dropping out from under you, people often describe a dark night of the soul in this stage, where nothing makes sense, where old meaning collapses and no new meaning has yet formed. This is why awakening is terrifying. It does not ask politely for your consent. It strips you bare, But death in this sense is not an end, it is preparation for rebirth into a clearer awareness of what is true. A third concept is responsibility. Once illusions fall away, you realize no one else can leave your truth for you. Institutions, traditions, and authorities can offer frameworks, but they cannot replace your direct seeing. Awakening demands maturity, because the crutches are taken away. When you see that you are the source of meaning, not a passive recipient of it, life feels both liberating and heavy, terrifying, because the excuses you once used, society, upbringing, fate, lose their grip. You are left with yourself, naked awareness, and the choices you make from it. Then there is the theme of time. Awakening collapses the way you usually hold past, present, and future. You may realize that the past is only memory playing in your mind, and the future is only imagination projected forward. What remains is the immediacy of now. At first this feels disorienting, because your identity has been stitched together from those mental timelines. Without them, you may feel groundless, but this groundlessness is also the opening into something profound. The recognition that life is not moving towards some distant point, but is always already here, unfolding in this very moment. The terror comes from losing the story of continuity. But the truth is freedom from being trapped by it. Another core element is the dissolution of self. The ego, the I you think you are, is revealed as a bundle of habits, thoughts, and conditioning. Awakening shows that there is no fixed center inside you. At first, this is deeply unsettling. If you are not your thoughts, not your body, not your memories, then what are you? Many resist at this stage, clinging harder to identity, reinforcing labels and rules. But if you endure the unraveling, you discover awareness itself silent, spacious, not confined to the small self. This is where fear transforms into awe, but only after the terror of letting go of the familiar. The theme of paradox also runs through awakening. It shows you that opposites you thought were separate are in fact inseparable. Light and dark, joy and suffering, self and other all collapse into a deeper unity. This is not a concept, but a lived recognition. Yet the ego resists paradox, because it wants clear lines. It wants certainty. Awakening terrifies because it denies certainty and throws you into mystery. You see that truth is not a neat formula, but a living, breathing presence beyond words. Finally, there's the theme of silence. Awakening often leaves you without answers. You realize that words, however profound, cannot contain the vastness of what is seen. This silence is not empty, though it is alive, luminous. But reaching it requires you to face the noise of your mind, the chatter of conditioning, the voices of culture that echo inside you. Sitting in that silence can feel unbearable at first, like being swallowed by emptiness, and yet, on the other side of terror, silence becomes the most intimate presence, the ground of all being. These themes illusion versus reality, death and rebirth, responsibility, time, dissolution of self, paradox, and silence are not abstract. They are the backbone of why spiritual awakening destabilizes, why it strips life to its bones. People imagine awakening as a path of addition, as if you will gain new insights and powers. But its true nature is subtraction. It takes away what is false until only what is real remains. That is not glamorous. It is raw, often frightening, but also unmistakably true. When words like spiritual awakening isn't what you think, it's far more terrifying or spoken. They resonate more than just intellectually. They carry echoes of myths, archetypes, and stories older than civilization itself. Humanity has always turned to narrative and symbol to express what cannot be neatly explained. Awakening is too vast, too paradoxical to fit into plain description. So it leaks through stories, and those stories, when read with a deeper eye, reveal that awakening has always been as much about terror as it is about transcendence. Consider the image of the caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. It seems sweet, almost childlike, but what actually happens inside the cocoon is gruesome. The caterpillar dissolves into a soup of cells, its body breaking apart completely before the blueprint of the butterfly takes form. This is the hidden allegory of awakening. What you are must dissolve, often painfully, before something greater can emerge. People cling to the beauty of wings but forget the horror of the dissolution. In many traditions, the myth of descent captures this same truth. In Greek mythology, Persephone is dragged into the underworld, separated from the world of light. Only after she endures the darkness does she rise again, crowned as queen of both realms. In Sumerian myth, Inanna descends into the underworld and is stripped of her powers, one by one, until she stands naked before the throne of death. She dies there before being restored, transformed. These stories are not just ancient entertainment, they are maps. They show that awakening is a descent before it is an ascent, is stripping before a flowering. Another symbolic narrative comes from the desert. The prophets and mystics often withdrew into desolation, places stripped of comfort. Moses on Sinai, Jesus in the wilderness, Muhammad in the cave all faced silence and emptiness before returning with vision. The desert is not just physical but inner. It represents the burned stage where the ego's illusions fall away, where nothing external feeds you anymore. Terrifying because you are left with yourself and the silence. Yet only in that silence does something new speak. There is also the alchemical story, often misunderstood as primitive chemistry. The alchemists wrote of turning lead into gold, but the deeper work was transformation of the soul. Lead symbolized the heavy, unawakened self. Gold was the luminous awareness beyond ego. The process was not gentle. It required fire, dissolution, death of form. The vessel would crack if it was not strong enough to withstand the intensity. This is why awakening is described as fire. It purifies by burning away what cannot remain. The alchemist's furnace is your own life. And the terrifying part is that you do not control the flames once they begin. Another symbol worth considering is the labyrinth. In myth, heroes enter the twisting passages to face the beast within. Theseus confronts the Minotaur in darkness, and only by slaying it does he emerge free. The labyrinth is the mind itself, full of winding patterns, conditioning, and shadows. Awakening is the moment you stop running through corridors and confront the beast, the ego, the illusions, the fears you've avoided. Terrifying because the beast is you. Yet freedom lies on the other side of that confrontation. The phoenix, burning in its own fire and rising from ashes, tells the same truth in another language. The self must burn, not once, but many times. Each death feels final. Each collapse feels unbearable. But what rises after is lighter, freer. No culture left out this symbolism because the pattern is universal. Awakening is not linear growth, but repeated cycles of destruction and renewal. In Eastern traditions, there is also the story of illusion as a play. Hindu philosophy describes the universe as Lila, a divine drama. To awaken is to realize you are both actor and audience, mask and face. But here again lies terror. If it is all a play, then what of your ambitions, your struggles, your deeply held identities? They dissolve into roles, temporary costumes worn by consciousness. Most people resist this idea because it destabilizes the sense of being serious, important, fixed, and yet beneath that resistance is liberation, the freedom of knowing you are not confined to a single rule. The Bible, too, carries this undertone. Jacob wrestles with an angel through the night, terrified and broken, before receiving his new name, Israel. Awakening often feels like that wrestling match. You struggle with forces you cannot control, and you emerge limping, marked forever. The limb itself becomes a sign you can never walk the old way again. What unites these stories? The cocoon, the descent, the desert, the furnace, the labyrinth, the phoenix, the divine play. The wrestling angel is the same underlying truth. Awakening terrifies because it demands death before new life. The terror is not punishment, but initiation. The old self resists, fights, and suffers because it senses its end. But through that ending, something vast and indestructible emerges. It is helpful to see that your own experiences may already mirror these symbols. Perhaps you have felt the cocoon dissolving you, or wandered in the desert of emptiness, or faced the labyrinths of your mind. These are not abstract myths. They are archetypal patterns repeating in human lives. When you recognize them, you see that your terror is not unique. It is part of a story humanity has always told. Awakening isn't neat, isn't comforting. It is terrifying precisely because it is real. The myths show us that terror is not the enemy, but the doorway. You pass through fire to find gold, through ashes to find wings, through darkness to find vision. And only by acknowledging the terror can you walk the path authentically. The question always lingers: if spiritual awakening is as terrifying as the myths, metaphors, and truths suggest, how does one live with it? It is one thing to talk about illusions dissolving and egos dying, but another to step back into daily life with these realizations pressing against the ordinary flow of work, relationships, and responsibilities. Integration is the part most people overlook. Awakening itself can come like a flash of lightning, but learning to live after the strike, that is the deeper work. When illusions fall away, you can no longer look at your life in the same way. You may notice that your routines feel hollow. What once seemed like ambition now appears as compulsion, the endless chase for money, recognition, or comfort no longer satisfies because you see through it. This does not mean you stop working, stop earning, or stop engaging with the world. It means you relate differently. You no longer mistake these things for your identity. They become tools, not masters. But this shift is destabilizing at first. It can feel like walking in two worlds at once: the world of appearances and the world of raw awareness. Relationships often change as well. Awakening makes you less able to play old roles. If you once lived by pleasing others, you may no longer tolerate it. If you built yourself around conflict or control, those habits collapse. People around you may not understand. Some may even pull away because you no longer mirror the image they had of you. This is one of the terrifying costs. Awakening can isolate, yet it also clears the ground for authentic connection, where you relate not from masks but from presence. Practically, integration means learning to carry silence into noise. You may taste deep awareness in meditation or solitude, but the true test is whether you can remain grounded while sitting in traffic, dealing with family tension, or facing uncertainty in your work. Spiritual awakening is not meant to detach you from reality, but to root you in it more deeply. The terror teaches you to stop escaping. The real-world implication is that your presence itself becomes the anchor, not the circumstances. There is also the matter of responsibility. Awakening strips away the comfort of blaming. Once you see that you are not merely a product of society or fate, you realize that how you live is your choice. This responsibility is heavy. You cannot unsee it, but it is also empowering. Instead of drifting unconsciously, you act with clarity. Even small actions, how you speak to someone, how you spend an hour, become infused with weight. Not because you seek perfection, but because you know each act is the expression of awareness-informed. Integration also confronts you with paradox. You see that life is both empty and full, meaningless and meaningful at once. Practically, this means you stop seeking a single formula to live by. You embrace flexibility, flowing with what rises rather than forcing everything into rigid categories. The terror softens into humility. Because you realize you cannot control reality, only meet it in the real world. Awakening often brings a re-evaluation of values. Many find they no longer care for endless consumption. Simplicity becomes natural, not out of moral duty, but because clutter feels unnecessary. Others feel drawn to creativity, service, or teaching not as ego-driven pursuits, but as natural expressions of awareness. The terrifying part is that these shifts can upend the life you thought you wanted. Careers, possessions, even goals may dissolve. Yet the freedom on the other side is that you are no longer chained to them. Another practical implication is the way awakening reframes suffering. Pain does not disappear. Life still brings illness, loss, and struggle, but suffering is no longer seen as punishment or injustice. You see it as part of the texture of existence, not separate from joy. This perspective allows you to endure what comes without collapsing under it. The terror here is in realizing you cannot escape suffering, but the liberation is in no longer being enslaved by it. Awakening also reshapes how you experience time. Without the weight of past and future, you become more present in daily life. Washing dishes, walking, or listening to someone speak all become complete in themselves. This does not mean you stop planning or reflecting, but you no longer confuse plans with reality. You see them as tools. The implication is a quieter mind, but also a confrontation with boredom and emptiness, terrifying, because stillness can feel unbearable. Yet once you pass through that discomfort, you find a depth in ordinary life that was invisible before. Integration requires patience. The terror does not vanish overnight. It ebbs and flows. Some days you feel clarity, other days confusion. The ego does not die in one stroke, it rebuilds itself in subtle ways. But with each cycle of recognition, you become less identified with it. The practical reality is that awakening is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process, woven into every moment of living. And perhaps the most real-world implication is this: once awakened, you cannot fully return to sleep. You may try, you may wish you could forget, but the awareness remains. It follows you into everything. At times this feels like a curse because you can no longer pretend. But it is also the blessing hidden inside the terror. You are free, even if freedom feels heavier than the chains once did. Spiritual awakening is not the romantic escape many imagine. It is not a shining crown placed gently on your head. It is fire that burns away everything false. It is not comfort, but confrontation. The terror of awakening lies in this exact truth. It takes away all the scaffolding you thought you needed to stand. It strips you bare, leaving you with nothing but raw existence. And yet this is also its gift. The very thing that terrifies is the thing that frees. When the illusions fall, what remains is not void but presence. What remains is not despair but clarity. The terror shows you that you are not the mask, not the story, not the fleeting roles. You are the awareness in which all of it rises. Many will run from this. They will cling to comfort, to distraction, to the lies that soothe. That is their path. And it is not wrong. But for those who dare to face the terror, the reward is a life unshaken by circumstance. Not a perfect life, not a painless life, but a real one, a life lived awake. The call, then, is not to seek awakening as a prize or an escape. The call is to stop running, to sit with the silence you fear, to let the old stories die, even when it feels like you are dying with them. To trust that what remains is not emptiness, but truth. Because here is the paradox. The terror of spiritual awakening is also its doorway. The fear you feel is not a sign of failure, but a sign that you are standing at the edge of freedom. Step through it.